Welcome to the Center for Universal Education at Brookings. I'm Rebecca Winthrop. I'm the director here. Um, we're really pleased you could spend the morning with us. We're hoping you will spend the whole morning with us. I want to just tell you for a second about our work here at the center. We are focused on education across the developing world, largely focused on ensuring access to quality education for all children and youth in particular. Sometimes, another way of putting this, we talk about equitable learning, so equitable opportunities for all children and young people to learn and develop their capacities fully. And there has been quite a bit of progress in education over the last decade or so, largely on the backs of developing country governments, which I think we really need to recognize and celebrate, but also with great partnership with development partners. And to me, this really signals that if the education community pulls together and works towards a set of shared goals, that it really can achieve progress. And there's been a huge upswing in enrollments in primary education over the last decade. But there is a great urgency to continuing to work collectively together on the question of quality education for all. Primarily because we have 1,000 more days left until we meet till we should meet the Millennium Development Goals and the Education for All goals. And we've got some problems in the world. There's roughly 60 million kids out of primary school, 70 million kids out of secondary school, 250 million kids can't master basic reading skills, even if they've spent up to 4 years in school, and 200 million kids, young people, don't have the skills and capacities they need for successful livelihoods in life. So there is a significant amount of work to do. And education is important not only because it's important that these young people around the world get the benefits of education, it's their right, it's a social justice issue, but it's also really very important for a global issue. It's a development issue, it's an economic issue. Education is at the cornerstone of development. We all, I think, are probably quite familiar with the data that shows unquestionably that more education and better quality education makes people healthier, wealthier. It's one of the best interventions to break the cycle of intergenerational poverty. And today what we want to do is spend the morning with you talking about two barriers in particular to accelerating progress and meeting quality education for all young people. What we have lined up for all of you is two panels this morning, and then we'll have a short break and a panel afterwards, followed by a lunch where we hope to be able to talk with all of you and you talk with each other. The first subject for this panel here is around financing. And the panel following the break is around quality, improving quality. So financing is a very timely topic this week because we are on the eve of the World Bank International Monetary Fund spring meetings, where the world's finance ministers, most of them anyways, gather and talk about, guess what, issues of financing. And for the first time in a long time, and actually I can't remember, Beth, if this is one of the only times, is it the only times to have education?
Ministers of Finance and Education, I would say yes.
Okay, so this is one, so we've got it from Beth that this week it's very exciting for us as the global education community because it's the first time that with ministers of finance and education, the topic of education is on the agenda for these spring meetings. There will be tomorrow an April ministerial meeting in April. Tomorrow, we are in April. Tomorrow there'll be a ministerial meeting focused on education. It starts at 8 a.m. and goes all the way through, Lord knows, I don't know, 9 at night or something. It is quite exciting. There's been a partnership that's been pulled together under the auspices of the Global Education First Initiative, which is the global initiative launched by the UN Secretary General at the General Assembly last General Assembly, And it's largely the United Nations, with the Secretary General will be there, the Gordon Brown, the UN Special Envoy, and various UN agencies, as well as the World Bank and the Global Partnership for Education have all sort of come together to partner with 8 countries that together represent half of the world's out-of-school children, and they're talking specifically with each of these countries to come up with some very concrete solutions for accelerating progress in the next 2.5 years to meet the MDG goals in particular. So on sort of the eve of those discussions, I think it's quite timely for all of us here to talk about what do we need to do. A, first, what do we know? And B, what do we need to do about getting more resources to the education sector? Because indeed, financing is a major problem for accelerating progress. Certainly not the only problem, but it's a major problem. The UNESCO Global Monitoring Report recently released last month new estimates on what the financing gap is. They've come up with $26 billion annually is the financing gap for basic education. And they have a handout, which we're passing out, and I hope you pick it up with more information around that. And we can think about financing in maybe 3 buckets. The first is really governments with out-of-school populations, governments with low-quality systems, and actually, governments have really been doing their part over the last decade. Not all of them, but many of them. So $3 billion additional dollars have been generated by low-income governments. Many low-income governments spend 20% of their budgets on education. And there was a great report recently by the UNESCO Institute of Statistics that showed that in sub-Saharan Africa, real expenditures on education went up by 6% over the last decade. So, that is a group that does need to finance education more and do better, but it has been doing a lot. There is estimates that if every low-income government increase their spending or increase to 10% of GDP, their investments in education, then $7.5 billion in additional resources could be generated. But also, I think a question we have to ask is how much more effective resources could be that are existing, how governments can better use existing education resources to get the outcomes we want. So those are 2 things in particular that low-income countries' governments could do. The second bucket is really about donors, aid donors, and what's happening there. I'm sad and sorry to report, even though, of course, I don't represent any of them, that actually this is not a group that has been towing their weight. There's been quite a bit of excitement and investment early on from donors in education. In 2010, education donor aid was $5.8 billion, but it's stagnating. And it looks quite likely to go down along with the rest of official development assistance that is going down. There's a number of governments that have cut their aid to education. Belgium, Canada, France, Japan, the Netherlands, Spain, and the US. Just last week, the US, the president released his budget in which there is a 37% decrease for basic education from existing levels. So it's actually not a very pretty picture. And what can we do about it? We can certainly all work together to pressure donors to maintain their commitments and increase their commitments to education aid. There are some really good bright spots that are increasing their aid to education and doing quite a bit more. Australia, Denmark, Germany, Norway, and the UK are all of them. And I think we need to include pressure to increase bilateral assistance, but also for donors to continue to invest multilaterally. There seems to be, and I hope, Alice, you will talk about this, a huge sort of demand for global partnership for education funding, for one example of multilateral support. Just this year, as I understand it, there's $1.3 billion from low-income country governments in requests for funding from GPE, all of whom have a credible education plan, are ready to roll, are ready to work, and need resources. The last, sort of the third bucket, perhaps, to think about when we talk about financing, and I hope all of you will come up with some ideas to discuss, is new mechanisms, new models for investments. As an example, the business sector, the private sector, spends 16 times the amount on health as it does on education. There's all sorts of interesting mechanisms that we can learn from in other sectors, such as the health sector, who work with advanced market commitments. There's ideas about leverage funds and social bonds. There's also a movement in Europe, for example, that many governments are beginning to take up, where they are instituting financial transaction taxes, which just is a little tiny bit of money off of each financial transaction. That, if those governments could be convinced to put a small percentage of that money into development, and particularly into education, could yield tens of billions of dollars annually for our sector. But we need to work with those governments and try to encourage them to do that. The first one who enacted the financial transaction tax last year was France, and a percentage did go to development, but it only went to health and climate change, and education was left out completely. So there's a great need to continue to push these issues. I'm very pleased that we have a very distinguished panel who will talk about all of this with you, and I wanted to introduce them briefly. I'm not going to go into any great depth because you have the packets and you have their full bios, and I'm sure you've studied them in detail. But Elizabeth King is the Director of Education for the Human Development Network at the World Bank. Kevin Watkins is our Senior Fellow here at the Center for Universal Education. Alice Albright is rapidly trying to find her phone and turn it off, but is the new Chief Executive Officer for the Global Partnership for Education. I'm just glad it wasn't my phone. Nigel Chapman is the CEO of Plan International. And I wanted to just say one last thing, which is that I originally the UN Special Envoy for Education, Gordon Brown, was planning to attend and planning to moderate our two sessions this morning, and he sent a note saying he really regrets not being here. He had to attend the funeral for Margaret Thatcher today in the UK, and he'll be coming over as soon as that's done, I imagine, if it is already done. He wanted to pass the message along that this is the issue of financing in particular is of extreme concern to him. There will be a series of events throughout the week on this April, sort of the spring meeting docket, some in private sessions with the business community, some with civil society members, with Education International and Global Campaign for Education and others on Friday. And he will be following it. And I believe, Alice, you'll be reporting back the sort of topics that came out of this conversation to him. So thank you very much. And with that, Kevin, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Well, I've got the easy part this morning. I just have to ask a few questions. For those of you who hadn't worked out that I'm not Gordon Brown, I'm not. But I do know this is an issue, as Rebecca said, that Gordon is absolutely passionate about, the financing for education. And I was actually talking to Alice before we came into the meeting. And I met Alice very briefly, I think, in 2002 or 2003, when Gordon was Chancellor in the UK. And between them, a group of people in the Treasury and Alice's team at Gavi, the vaccination initiative, they developed the idea of bond financing for vaccines. And I think that initiative has probably saved several hundreds of thousands of lives, possibly millions of lives. And I think that's exactly the sort of innovative and bold thinking that we need to see brought to bear in education. So we have an opportunity to discuss that and other issues this morning. I'm going to first of all turn to Beth.
I thought it was supposed to be Alice. I'm happy to go first. Mr. Chair.
Well, actually, now that you've mentioned it, and now that I've actually looked at my script, I will get you back for that later. Alice, let's start with your role. That you come in at a very difficult time, as Rebecca mentioned. That we've seen a slowdown in progress. We have a big issue, big problem in funding and major financing gaps. And I wonder, just drawing on your experience from your Gavi years and more recently the Export-Import Bank, what is the sort of perspective that you have on the scope for innovative financing in education?
Well, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here. And I did start my job about 2 months ago, and it's been a great pleasure to get to know everybody in the global education community. I'm actually, despite the difficulties that you've talked about and that Rebecca's talked about, I am very optimistic for the future of education for a number of reasons. And I'll just go through them and then we'll talk a little bit about innovative financing. So why am I optimistic? One is that the ministers of education in the countries that we work with, we have a partnership model and there are about 57 countries that are part of our model, they are absolutely devoted to fixing this problem. I just met half an hour ago with the Minister of Education from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, certainly one of our most difficult partner environments, and they have just motivated additional financing, domestic financing, towards education because they understand the importance of it. So I sort of come back and I say, if they can do it, we can do it, and we need to be inspired by them. So I'm optimistic for that reason, and he is a great friend and a great colleague of ours. And I again think, my goodness, if they can do it, we can do it. But I also think the real reason that I'm optimistic about it is education is such a compelling investment. The more that I think about the leverage potential of education over the well-being of an economy, it ought to be just the most compelling argument and easy argument to make. So think about the following things. In order to use a packet of seeds, you need to be able to read it. In order to read your yellow immunization card that is so important to us in the global health space, you have to be able to read it. Think about the competitiveness of economies. Think about prosperity. Think about the well-being of families and communities and children. I mean, the list goes on and on. Security issues, climate issues. In order to have a country and a population and a society be able to be well-positioned to contend with all those difficulties, people have to be educated and not just go to school, but actually learn something in school. So I think that one of the challenges we all have is to really make that argument very effectively. One of the things that I'm struck by is a gap, and you mentioned a very useful number, Rebecca, between the fact that now GPE has $1.3 billion or so of pending grants that we're looking to fund, yet, like everybody else, we are struggling to raise money. That gap should tell you something, because what it tells you is that the countries, despite all the difficulties involved, have developed compelling education sector plans. One of the things I found very interesting about GPE is the business model, that it motivates sectoral change, not just little one-off changes. So we have $1.3 billion worth of pending applications. These are countries that want to get on with it, and we need to get the money for that. So I'm very optimistic about that as well. What do we do about it? First thing is, the more I think about education and I talk to people and learn from people, one argument that I find very compelling is that education is a global public service as opposed to global public good. I know that the purist economists in the room would probably faint if they heard me say that. I'm going to say it anyway. It is a global public service, and we have to finance it that way. It is a fundamentally government activity. So at some level here, this has to be a government-to-government and domestic government-to-government activity, and there's no way of getting around that. And I think we have to make that argument in as compelling terms as we can to our various stakeholders. It also means bringing on new governments. I'm very pleased that we're beginning to reach out to countries that are not traditional ODA providers, and I'm very encouraged by our early conversations with those organizations. We are going to keep at that. The other dimension to this, which is actually different from global health, is in global health, we went and we amassed a lot of money with IFM and other things, and we went and we bought things on the global market called vaccines. Okay, there is room for some goods in this case, but we're really financing services. So we need to have money to governments to finance services, and we need money locally to finance services, because there's also a currency dimension here that could get to be interesting. So the solutions, I mean, anybody, and I've said this to a lot of people at GPE so far, anybody who thinks that we're just going to do a cut and paste job of IFM to GPE is wrong, because the nature of the solution is wrong. We have to fashion our own answers here. And I think there are some answers that we can begin to look at, particularly in the financial transactions tax area, but also as far as local financing, innovative financing things are concerned. Let me make one more point about the private sector. I am very eager to work with the private sector, and the reason why is I think that, first of all, they are huge stakeholders in the area of education. They are beneficiaries of a talented workforce in many respects, and I think they have a lot to bring. And those who I've met so far, what really strikes me is how much they can add to the whole area of infrastructure. In many cases, the challenge in reaching the children who are in the most remote areas and don't have access to schools, that problem can be solved with technological solutions if we can figure it out. So I am really eager to, it's not a financing solution, it's more of a how do you do it solution. But that's the way that I think we can really engage the private sector. So lots of good things to work on together.
Thanks, Alice. That's a great way to start the ball rolling on a very positive note. Beth, now it is your turn. Beth, the bank clearly plays a leadership role in this area, both financially and intellectually, in a way. And in relation to some of the issues that Rebecca was raising, about many countries being left behind, many groups being left behind within countries, what is the bank really doing to promote an agenda for delivering on education and the Millennium Development Goal targets?
Thank you, Kevin. And thank you very much to the Center for putting this panel together and the invitation to contribute to the discussion. I'd like to start a little bit with very similar to what how Alice started, which is on in a way, the demand for education by countries and government and by the people themselves. This past months, we've been going through an exercise of how we can re-energize the bank under our new president, and examining also whether we are putting our resources and our efforts on the right things. And so we've had this country survey on what are the priorities of countries, what sectors, and then there's also this My World survey of people. And through both surveys, education comes out at the very top. All the countries that who have been surveyed put education as the priority area for themselves. And I was just looking at the My World results, and both for women and men, overall, a good education is the very top priority of people. So both from the government side as well as from countries, from populations. And I think that should send a very strong message to the development community. It should send a very strong message to governments. And it's heartening to see that governments and people are seeing the role that education can play, both in building good citizenship, societies that can work well, and for growth and for development as a whole. We've been talking about, Rebecca was mentioning the total levels of aid or resources for education. I think she started off very well by saying that this is, in a way, a primary concern of government, that governments who are committed to the development of their country, to the internal progress, need to prioritize education. But also she says that the development community have to think about how to prioritize education and how to grow the resources going to education. At the World Bank, I think that we have, for basic education, kept our commitment over the years. We do experience fluctuations in that demand, but if you look at the overall trend from the year 1990 or even the year even the year 2000, when the CAR happened, or was the CAR the declaration was made, our lending for basic education has had an increasing trend. And in fact, this last year, FY12, as well as this year, FY13, we have the largest amounts going to basic education than historically. And I think this is, we are very much pushing for 2015 to do our best for that. I think that we have to be, while we need to look at the total levels, we need to think about how smartly we are using the resources. And the smart way of using the resources is not only an issue for government, it should be an issue as well for external funders. For example, we have countries that are doing pretty well, like India, for example. India has the resources, has the growth, but it does have states that need to make a whole lot more progress. Looking at marginalized populations in countries that have resources, targeting marginalized populations need to be part of the way we think about expenditures for education. So targeting resources for high leverage is something that we need to think about. Efficiency, getting better, getting results is very important in thinking about resources for education. Efficiency, that means to say we need to think about what are the reducing costs for things that we need to spend for education. And then effectiveness or results is also something that we need to care about. And these are things that at the World Bank we do want to be paying more attention to, because even when we increase resources for education, for basic education, those resources are never going to be enough. So smart allocation of resources for education, smart way of spending and monitoring results would be things that really count. Also, lastly, to say that how we channel those resources that we spend also count. Alice had talked about how we need to think about the public sector and the public provision for education, but we need to think also about private provision for education. And I don't mean elite private schools. I don't mean elite private schools, but we have to recognize that religious institutions, that civil society groups and NGOs, these are all players in education, and how we channel our resources, whether only to government or we recognize the presence of the non-government sector is also very important.
Beth, thanks very much for that.
Thank you.
So Nigel, over to you. I mean, I think the one big part of this equation has to be that governments and donors partly do things because of pressure from below, and civil society really has a critical role to play in generating that pressure, and I think in communicating some of the messages that Alice was talking about as well. So it'd be very interesting for us to hear from you, both what you're doing in Plan, but your more general reflections on the role of civil society.
Yeah, Kevin, I think that's right. I mean, thank you very much for inviting me, first of all. It's great to be here. Sort of education's in my DNA, and it's in Plan's DNA, right back from 1937, when the first children left the Spanish Civil War and went to France and were looked after by Plan people, Plan volunteers, some of which were Americans, actually, from New York. Education was part of the curriculum of their life. So 75 years, education has been at the core of what we do. And I was reflecting, Kevin, on your question and thinking, why is it sometimes hard to mobilize people behind this? Not just governments, but also individual supporters. I think it's because education can sometimes seem to be a very kind of amorphous, big topic. And getting a handle on what difference you can make is quite testing and challenging. And in Plan, we have decided, among all the priorities we could pursue, that girls' education, trying to make sure that girls have 9 years of education, primary and secondary, is our big goal. That's what we want to see happen across the world. And so we're mobilizing money, we're mobilizing public support for that, we're putting pressure on governments, and we feel there's a niche. We have to work in a complementary way to others, not try and do the same things as everybody else. You can't do it all on your own. So that's one observation I want to make. We do mobilize a lot of money. If I can get my iPad to work, I can tell you. It's about 100 million. It's 100 million euros a year we spend on education, about 20% of our income. Now, if every government spent 20% of its income on education, going back to points earlier on, just how much more progress we'd be making than we are now. So we walk the talk in Plan. We do what we say we should do and want to do. And I'm very, very proud of that. And In Copenhagen in 2011, we committed to a further 55 million euros of spend, in addition to our 100 million a year in the GP Pledge Conference, which I was at with ministers before you started. It was a very, very important event, and we're committed to reach that target. So it's what we do to raise money from our supporters. That salience about girls and girls' rights. It does touch a chord. You've got to find a niche. It touches a chord, not just with women and girls, but with our supporters as a whole. And what we find is our supporters move from perhaps sponsoring a child to particularly pursuing this end, this great ambition. The second thing is, it's how we work with communities. The plan is absolutely enmeshed in communities. We're a community development organisation. Again, very, very proud of that. And I think we have kind of two roles there, essentially. First of all, as a CSO, to, in the most fragile state in the world, to provide services, not to apologise for service delivery. Service delivery is sometimes necessary. But building schools without teachers, without infrastructure to support them in the long run, just leads to empty schools. I've seen it myself. So we have to be very wary about bricks and mortar as a solution here, when there are so many more things that need to be done to create a quality education for boys and girls. So we have direct spend, but we also have policy and advocacy goals. It's 9 years of education, but also I think too to bring a gender lens to education planning. I think that's really critical in our case. If we believe girls are so important, we want to make sure that every education plan in every society reflects on the obstacles that prevent girls getting those 9 years of education. What can we do about it to prevent child marriage? What can we do to prevent schools that are unsafe for girls, where they feel threatened? What can we do to provide the right sort of facilities? I mean, in many places I go to, one of the biggest turn-offs which prevents girls getting an education is lack of sanitary facilities. This is not rocket science. It's the dangers of going to school, literally on the journey from home to school. So these things are known. They're not unknowns. They are known, and we can tackle them if we tackle them in a positive and determined way. And the final point to make, Kevin, is that it's about keeping the feet to the fire. We have to support civil society organisations in the planned 50 countries where we work to put pressure on governments to deliver what they say they will do, to put education up the priority list, to reflect back to them the survey, the My World survey that you were just talking about earlier on. I mean, if you're a politician and you hear that, you need to listen. Because if you don't listen, I would argue you won't get elected one day. So there is a public opinion mood about this, that if you don't catch it, you are at risk. And we have to be quite blunt about that sometimes, I think, and do that. And finally, this point about gender and the gender lens. I said these obstacles do exist, but there are ways in which you can look at education planning. I mean, you have tools which you share with us and we share with our civil society organisations to look at whether these priorities are right in a given country, and then to try and reorientate the priorities of education spend to combat them. And say it could be sometimes about the facilities themselves, it could be about the quality of the education, curriculum, it could be the quality of teachers, it could be a whole number of things. And then, as I say, to bring that pressure to bear. I'll give you a final example. In the Dominican Republic, the Dominican Republic spent less than 2% of its national income on education. Now, you were talking about 20 earlier on, as sort of aspiration. 2 is pretty pathetic, in my view. And by mass mobilization of children and young people, we basically forced the issue to get them to put it up to 4. Now, you say 4 is not, nirvana, it's not the promised land, but it's twice as much as it was before. And that's now part of the budget planning process. It's in the ordinance of the government. The new president has signed it. So if we could replicate that level of mass mobilization, so mass mobilization in the poorest countries in the world to tackle these inequities and inequalities, particularly around girls, and a mass mobilization in our richer societies, in the UKs of this world. You were kind about the UK earlier on, but that's partly because of public pressure to keep the ODA budget high, not to trim, not to reduce below the 0.7%. In other places, there's not the public pressure. We in Plan have something like 1.5 million individual supporters around the world. And I want to mobilize them to keep government's feet to the fire on their aid commitments.
Thanks very much, Nigel. You'll have an opportunity to follow up on that in a little while. So before we throw it open for discussions, I want to ask each of you one question, and you can feel free to interact with each other and completely ignore me if you want to. Alice, I mean, I guess the question to you is the most obvious one. That you set out what I think almost everybody in this room believes, that education is a really fundamental part of what happens to society. We know the data on growth. We know that the children of educated mothers are 2 to 3 times more likely to survive. We know that education empowers people to secure their entitlements and all of these things. And yet, over the last decade, you have to say that somehow that hasn't had that message or that evidence hasn't had traction. And, it's either because people don't understand the evidence or because I guess there's some sort of perspective that there's a time horizon issue here. If you're a finance minister, you're talking about rates of return, but they don't really kick in until 15 years, by which time, unless it's Equatorial Guinea, you're probably not going to be in power. So I guess the issue is that it's partly a communication question, and I guess it's so important for you and your team in GPE. What is the way that we break through here?
Well, I think you're absolutely right about communications, and some of the things that you were saying, Nigel, were very interesting as well. One of, I think, the biggest differences between global health, as an example, and this is can you show results, and what is this sort of trigger point that you're looking at to tell if you've done a good job? Okay, in global health, it's taking a child and putting a vaccination in the child's arm, and you know that you've vaccinated that child. And in some cases, you have to do it 3 times if there's boosters and so forth, but you know it's done. And if the vaccine is effective, you know that child will be protected for life once you do the boosters. Okay, the same sort of trigger point, if you will, does not exactly defined the same way exist in education. However, I challenge that. Okay, every single person who's been around children knows if they're educated. They know if they can read. They know if they're enjoying doing math. They know if they're interacting with their friends in school, and if they're sort of getting used to being in groups and so forth. All the things that you know that. So we can measure that in the same way that you can measure immunization. It's just that people get daunted by, frankly, there is so much data in this space that you kind of get lost. That's one problem. But the difference between when you make the investment in an education system, whether or not it's a one-off thing or ongoing recurring expenses, and what the outcome is, which is, you're not going to know for a long time if a society is getting educated. I personally am going to challenge all of us to say, hold on a second, that's an excuse. Okay, we know if kids are reading. You know it in 2 or 3 years. We know that they can read. And there are tools that we can develop to help communities. This is getting to your point. One of the things I find most interesting about the education space in GPE is the role of civil society organizations at the local level and the communities. Communities want their kids to be educated. They want them to be educated. Local government wants their children to be educated. I mean, that just has to be true. So I think that we can put pressure on governments, on donors, on stakeholders to, first of all, let's develop the way of determining if kids are reading and doing math. It has to be measurable. I've also had some fascinating conversations with my colleagues about the science of learning how to read. You can deconstruct it into how you learn how to read. So we should be able to understand if that's happening. And I think that the reason why people have had a harder time getting their head around this is the results are harder to get at. I think we can fix that problem. The results are longer term. I think we can fix that problem. The other thing, and I've said it amongst my colleagues a lot lately, is people have to think about education as an investment as opposed to an operating expense and fund it that way. Because there's all kinds of data that shows that if you invest in education at a certain time, then there will be upticks in all kinds of other things that we've talked about: agriculture, health, security, climate change, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So personally, I don't buy it that we can't show the results. I just think we haven't done it the right way. And we've got a room of very talented people here. We've got tons of talented partners at the World Bank. We have to be able to fix this problem. We have fixed more complicated problems than this one. So it's communication. It's taking advantage of all the muscle. You guys have a lot of muscle. And you're also very happy to be very sharp-elbowed and very grumpy on occasion, which is great. Which is great. I want the grumpy.
I like being grumpy.
Good. We should all use the grumpy, okay? Because I think that we should put pressure on ourselves to fix this problem.
Okay, so we have a new campaigning idea here, which is going to
Yes.
involve
Be grumpy today.
which is going to involve images of Nigel as Mr. Grumpy. For
No, I know what you mean. You
So
can't
one
afford to be
question-
too nice about it.
Right.
No.
Do you want me to-
well, let me just ask one. I want to just take a slightly different angle,
Okay.
and I'll get your take on this. So, when we all met in those very dark, very hot rooms in Dakar back in 2000, one of the I know you weren't there, but I was, and it scarred me for life. But one of the provisions that we got in the communique was that no country that is committed to achieving these goals will be allowed to fail for want of finance. And I think there are two things that come to my mind out of this. The first is that countries have been allowed to fail for want of finance, for want of other things as well, but also for want of finance. But one of the things that I think is coming out very strongly in the meetings this week, that Gordon and others and your colleagues have been involved in organising, is bringing over youth groups and constituencies that are working directly with kids who are being left behind. Child labourers, girl brides, people who are working, living in urban slums and so on. And to my mind, that we know when we look at the global data that the progress has slowed. We know that it's slowed principally because of a failure to reach these most marginalised children. And yet we're not developing the strategies and the financing approaches in the national planning framework and internationally that's reaching these kids. And one of the things that to my mind is very interesting when you interact with these groups, that we're all saying that governments are committed to planning, they're committed to education. That's not what these kids are saying. They're saying basically our governments don't care. Our governments are not serving our interests. Aid donors are not stepping up to the plate. And I wonder how we can somehow tap into the energy of those constituencies for change to push this issue onto the agenda of how do we develop the financing and the planning approaches that can reach the marginalised, which is, after all, what the bank's president is trying to do in health and other areas. And I'm just wondering, from your
what are some
perspective,
of the,
what are the things we can
some
do
of
in
the
education?
experiences that we do have in education? I think the World Bank had tried a couple of models, I think, on trying to use the energy of communities to channel resources to where the community really needs help. And that's a community development model, where you give more power over how resources are spent at the community level. Now, some people think that's really all just about decentralization rather than about community development, but I think we really need to think about the power of community development, the power of voice of the communities in determining how resources are going to be spent. That's something that I think the bank has contributed to with respect to at least the analytical work that we do, and allowing some of the operations to follow using those, using the results from analytical work. The other is conditional cash transfers, for example, which is something that we did not begin it. I think the earliest one that I've been involved with, the earliest program, was the Bangladesh Female Secondary Scholarship Project, Fellowship program in Bangladesh, which was really considered to be quite successful. It is using a small incentive to change behaviors at the family level. And then, we have the quite famous Mexico conditional cash transfer program, which has been deemed as successful by the people who have evaluated that, as well as the Bolsa Escola in Brazil. And the bank has actually brought together all the experiences, the lessons from experiences. How does one design such a program? And it's giving women, for example, giving the mothers more power within the household, and that they determine how those cash subsidies to households can be used, and to make sure that they are used for children, both the use of health services and also for higher enrollment rates. So I think the bank, I know most people, all people see the bank as mainly about money, about dollars, but it's not. We have a huge program of analytical work, and I think that's one of the ways we're contributing to this field.
Thank you. And then finally to Mr. Grumpy, Nigel.
Live this down now.
Nigel, the question I want to put to you is, I guess also the obvious one, that from the way that you've described it, and I think the passion with which you described it, it's clear that this is an issue that's very close to your heart and to the heart of your organisation. But let's face it, education is not exactly at the top of the NGO campaigning and advocacy agenda internationally, in a way that other issues are. If you think of nutrition, for example, that's a big force for mobilising people. And again, it's the flip side, I guess, of the question that I put to Alice. That, why is it that NGOs at the moment are not mobilising and galvanising public opinion around education in the way that that we really need in order to get the breakthrough?
Well, I suppose I'm going to be quite controversial here, because I think there's a risk that the programme priorities of NGOs get influenced by government priorities. And if governments start to think that they have to satisfy their electorates with results, it drives them down to things which are relatively time limited, easily measurable. So, and ministers love to get up, don't they, and talk about malaria and bed nets and lives saved, because that's a very concrete thing. Yeah. And this is in a climate where ODA is under pressure, political pressure. Economies are shrinking, people haven't got so much money to spend on government spending. So there's a risk that they sort of, government heads down to a narrow set of priorities, and then INGOs, because that's where the money is, head down to a narrow set of priorities. And education, which is a more complex, harder thing to fund, requires long-term commitment, not short-term commitment, gets dropped off at the end. That would be my kind of instinctive piece of analysis to explain why. And we have to fight it, and we have to fight it rather on the argument that you're putting, which is, of course, it's very important to have healthy children who are well fed, and they won't do well at school if they're not well fed and healthy. But being a healthy child with no education is not going to mean you're going to get a job. You're not going to have the skills to get a job which is going to cement the progress your family is making to lift yourself and your family out of poverty. That's the harsh truth that you're really saying, and we have to get that across as much as we can. And I don't think we should underestimate the public, actually, underestimate our supporters, because I think they do understand more than we give them credit for, more than governments give them credit for. And this narrowing of priorities, this search for the instant fix, the instant results, is not the right way to tackle some of the great social problems that society faces. I think it's fundamentally misconceived, and we therefore need to be on the front foot to tackle it. And that's why I'm quite grumpy about it, but I'm also quite happy to be unfashionable about it. To be unfashionable about it in the sense that to put education the highest priority, even though getting the money is tough. Actually, it's tough from governments to get the money sometimes. It's less tough from the public, actually, as individual supporters. The mobilisation around Because I'm a Girl is fantastic. They get it out there in the UK and America and Canada and so on. So let's put that pressure back on governments so that they get it too.
Great, thank you. So now we've got just over 30 minutes left. So I wanted to throw it open to you guys to ask questions to the panelists. I think what we'll do is we'll take them in batches of 3. And so, over to you. So there's lots of hands. I think I'm going to start right at the back. I can't see who's behind the hand, but the hand that's furthest back. Could you say who you are, please, as well?
Sure. Good morning. My name is Patricia Kiefer. I'm the International Director of the American Federation of Teachers. I'd like to go back to a subject that was raised by, I think, all of the panelists, which is the private sector involvement, and tease that out a little bit. There's private sector and there's private sector. This is a $1 trillion business and public funds. There's profit to be made. The question is, what kind of guidelines are used to engage the private sector, whether it's in technology, testing, public-private partnerships in establishing private schools? How do we protect the fact that each kid shouldn't be seen to have a profit margin on their head? And how do we do it under social responsibility and not with market incentivized profit making?
Thanks very much, Tricia. And maybe the person right in front of Tricia.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. This is Rashida Chowdhury from Campe, Bangladesh, but representing GCE, Global Campaign for Education, the board member, talking from the ground level. And it's realities that exist. One is, as an education campaigner, I'd like to sort of flag this point that providing basic education to each and every citizen is a state responsibility. It should be a non-negotiable principle, at least for us, a non-negotiable principle, because there could be other actors like private sector, NGOs, everybody, but it is a state responsibility. We should not be allowing our governments to shift their responsibilities. This is the principle. With regard to engaging the private sector, they're most welcome, but in the sense that there should be a right-based approach. It's not only with regard to CSR, making a profit, which is right, but also kind of ethical sense. On one hand, encouraging child labor, on the other hand, providing funds for education. That doesn't make any sense. So there has to be some kind of ethical responsibilities there. Thank you to Madam Albright for making it a point that education is a global public service. It should not be a good or commodity for sale, particularly in countries like ours, where shadow education is now covering most of our public education issues. So therefore, a right-based focus is so much needed if we really talk about equity, if we're really talking about minimizing the quality divide in education, because I could speak about South Asia, spending per year per child $30 to $50 US, where other countries like in the north, spending $3,000 to $5,000 US per year per child in primary education. Quality costs money, and that's where financing comes in. And the other point that I would like to make is the role of civil society. Well, it's not only money. Nigel, it's not only money coming in. There are also criminalization of civil society leaders in many countries. They are being harassed, education campaigners. We have got evidence and news, the Global Campaign for Education, because they are also in many countries, it's not only about money. NGOs are not only NGOs, teachers, media people, they are not being allowed to focus on a good education that the World Survey has been putting about. The issue of schools not enough, why it's hard to mobilize people. The example of Bangladesh has already come in because we have seen from the ground level that very low-cost education campaign or very low-cost community campaigns have been yielding results, like reducing maternal mortality, mortality, getting back children to school, even if we are facing challenges with quality and dropping out.
Thanks, Rashida.
So thank you so much for this particular intervention. But again, a rights-based approach is needed to make financing effective and efficient. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rashida. Can you just come a little bit further down, Melon, right in the middle here? Just here, yeah.
Hi, thank you, Kevin. Joshua Muskin from the Aga Khan Foundation. Beth, I'd like to quibble a little bit with something that you said, which was resources will never be enough. And I'd like you to talk maybe about what you mean by enough, because I think what we're talking about at this panel is we need enough resources to complete our commitments to education. And then also, we've been talking about financing of education sort of abstractly, and I'm wondering if anybody would talk about the specific issue of teachers being the largest part of any education budget, and what are some of the solutions or what are some of the particular issues that we're dealing with in addressing the provision of teachers in sufficient numbers and sufficient quality. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. I'm actually going to just take one more question from this side, right in the middle there, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Thank you. I'm Diane Richler, and I'm here representing Inclusion International, which is an organization of people with intellectual disabilities and their families. And I'd like to ask the panelists to address the issue of the children who are most excluded from school now and ensuring that they get in. And a concern that I have with some of the points that were made, two in particular, I'm all for increasing girls' education, but what we've often seen when education of girls has been a priority, that people are forgotten that there are a lot of girls who have disabilities. And if the education system is not transformed in a way that girls with disabilities are also included, then a system's going to be built up that's going to continue to include not just girls, but also boys who have disabilities. The other concern I have is a follow-up to one of the other comments that was made around the role of the private sector and often of NGOs in providing education. And what we've often seen is that with the best objectives or the best wishes, many civil society organizations have set up separate education systems for children with disabilities. What that does is it takes money out of the regular education system, and instead of strengthening the regular system so that it can include more students with disabilities, it serves a very small number of students. And I mean, our calculations are that there would never be enough money to provide completely separate systems for students with disabilities. So a question is, how can we encourage organizations like Plan, which is doing a lot of excellent work in the area of inclusive education, to invest more in building up the regular public system to be able to include all children, rather than segmenting what's happening at the community level so that some students are always educated apart from their peers?
Thank you very much. So let me just try and divide them up, but of course feel free to respond to any questions that you want to. So I think the first couple of questions in particular were on this question of the relationship between, on the one side, state obligation to protect the right to education, and the role of different types of providers, in the private providers, and the role of government as a regulator. But I just wonder how you see that, Alice, in the context of GPE's work, in that, we do have this proliferation of providers in education, this big expansion of low-fee private schools in particular. And I just wonder, in terms of the approach in GPE on that big question of the respective roles and responsibilities involved.
Well, I come at this in a very practical way, and I've spent a good chunk of my career either working in the private sector or working alongside the private sector on various topics, and I've got enormous respect for them. I think given the enormity of the challenge ahead of us, I think excluding anybody who has a role to play is a mistake. And I come at it in a very non-ideological way. That said, I think that the next step is that we have to unpack the challenge and figure out who is best placed to do what. And I don't think that the private sector is sort of a universal solution to everything. I also don't think the government sector is a universal solution to everything. I think that where the magic is really working together. So what do I mean by that? There are some systems that we've talked to. I met with one of the ministers from Africa. It was from Senegal a few weeks ago when I was in London. And they said something that I thought was very interesting, which is that there are some Quranic schools in his country where they have worked with the Quranic schools to have the Quranic schools provide education under curriculum guidelines that were essentially government-based, because they thought the Quranic schools were in place, they were working, they presented an opportunity for a bridge to a different community, and they're trying it. And he seemed very pleased with it. And I thought, well, gee, that sounds like an interesting idea. One of the other points that's very interesting to me is infrastructure. I think that governments ought to be looking at technology solutions where practicable, and I know that that's a big statement when we're talking about some countries, to begin to figure out how to reach areas of the population that are very remote. One of the things I've said often in my work so far is one of the sort of indisputable obvious facts right now is the technology wave that is washing across the world, and that is being driven by everyone's interest in connectivity. And I know that there's obviously many regions in the countries that we're familiar with where that's simply not an option yet. I'll say yet. But it's an obvious force in terms of distributing content, know-how, testing materials, I mean, you name it. And it's hard to look at the panoply of issues in this space and ignore that wave. It's hard to, it just doesn't make sense. So that's another area that I think we ought to think about working with the private sector. One of the things that the chair of our board, Carol Bellamy, did, which I thought was a very, very appropriate and good strategic call for this space, is that Carol has invited the teachers to be on the GPE board, and we now work with them very closely. In fact, I'm meeting with them over the course of this week. We work very closely with the teachers, not only at a sort of a strategic global level at GPE, but also in the countries, because we think that they're obviously essential parts of the equation. But my I guess lasting comment is, let's not let the solution set be curtailed by being ideological about what different players represent. Let's look at a full set of solutions and then go from there.
Thanks, Alice. Beth, there was actually one question specifically to you on resources
Right.
and teachers. But as I say, do feel free to respond more widely.
Right. But I just want to add to, I love the last comment that Alice made, which is we need many kinds of solutions. We need innovative solutions. We need effective solutions. And if we put ideology before us and use that to constrain solving the problems that face us in education, I think we lose a lot. I think that households our families are voting with their feet with respect to education. I think that the word private tends to, get people all excited, and you have to visit some of the poorest communities in some of the poorest countries and see that those schools that you're calling private are not what you would recognize as private. They are, first of all, you've got to distinguish between provision, financing, and regulation as roles of government. That government doesn't have to provide everything, but because of the human right to basic education, you would like governments to be able to finance the basic education of all children. And that is a principle that we accept here. We don't want children not to go to school because they cannot afford schooling. But if you restrict the provision only to governments, when in areas where government capacity is restricted, you have just allowed many children to leave them out of school. That's the reality in many, many poor communities. And you have to also realize that many of the non-state providers are not profit-making. They are, in fact, sometimes more heavily publicly financed than public schools in urban areas. Just take a look at their financing. Look at who's funding them. It's the government, it's not some corporation. This is the northern model of what non-public provision is, and don't apply it to the poorest areas. So I think that is what we would like to make a plea for just being open-minded about the kinds of solutions that we need to be able to meet the basic challenges. And even the teachers in those schools are actually public school teachers. They're actually government hired and government paid, right? So it's a very different kind of animal than the one that we tend to think of here in the US or other Western countries. So please, just the plea for openness. It's not only about resources, Josh. I believe that, except probably for some really poor countries and smaller countries, what we are able to do in GPE, and the World Bank is a very committed partner of the Global Partnership for Education, is that the resources that we can muster as external funders is not going to be sufficient. Our resources will have to come with ideas. It will have to come with ideas not necessarily from the North, and probably not at all from the North, but from the successful experiences in other similar countries, in developing countries. And this South-South exchanges of knowledge, of experience, of solutions that work is something that we, as a development community, a broader development community, will have to make happen. And when I say South-South, it's not even from one country to another country, but from, let's say, from Java to Sumatra, from Madhya Pradesh to Bihar, or vice versa. So it's these kinds of experiences, and we have, as a development community, to be able to collect this and to learn from it, and to be able to provide, to be able to be a good, to provide that platform for the exchange of ideas. Solutions is not all about just how much you spend per student. And you have to take a look at the PISA reports, that for the richest countries, the countries that spend the most for their children are not the countries that actually do the best for their children. So you have to, that's simply what I mean by resources are not going to be enough.
Thanks very much, Beth. Nigel, there was a question from Diana on this issue of inclusive education, and I think she raised a specific issue of disability, but I think it's a broader one, in the types of children that we're talking about who are being left behind clearly have distinctive needs, whether it's financing needs or needs in relation to the teaching process. And I know in Plan, that this is something you think about a lot, and you've developed an inclusive education model. But I'd be very interested in your take on that question and any other that you might want to respond to.
Well, we have developed an inclusive education model, Kevin, you're right, and that's about the way in which we work with communities in the long run and the way we interact with them. So, we're very much influenced by their priorities. I mean, I don't want to put a sort of false distinction between sort of girls and gender on the one hand and disability on the other. I'll raise my voice a bit, because obviously, as you say, there are many disabled children who are girls, so we've got to link the two up together. And I think in some of our best work we're managing to do that, but we are often dealing with some very entrenched social attitudes here. In many of the societies we work, there is a huge stigma about disability. So it's not so much what the school is necessarily doing, it's what's going on in the community as well. And I remember being in Egypt fairly recently, and we set up a centre for disabled children to come and get some sort of education in the mornings. And it was the only time those children left the home in the week, because the rest of the time the families were literally hiding the children away from the rest of society because they were embarrassed about it. So it's rather like with child marriage too. You know, you've got deep entrenched social attitudes which you have to work with. So it's not so much an education intervention as such, it's more an intervention about working with those communities to change attitudes towards disability or towards the rights of girls in the context of education, rather than a sort of head-on education angle. Do you know what I mean? It's not quite as that straightforward. Can I just comment very quickly on two others? It's a fascinating time now working with the private sector. You know, I spend time with companies who, as a student, I protested against. You know, you said if I'd be in the same room as these people, I won't name them, but I think you could think of who I might mean. You know, I would have my placards in the 70s. In 2011, I'm sitting down with them because we need to work on solutions together. And one of the biggest areas we need to work on solutions together is the digital divide and gender. I mean, it would be crazy for us not to work with Intel, who do some of the most interesting research, by the way, on this at the moment, not to work with Microsoft and Accenture and Nokia on working to improve the quality of technology and standards in schools, when they know so much more about it than we do, and frankly, they know far more about it than most governments know about it. That's the truth. So we'd be crazy not to do so. And there's plenty of examples now where I think that ideological divide has been crossed. And the third thing is about the closing space of civil society, which is the point that the contributor from Bangladesh made. There's an irony here. An irony we have to be very, very careful about, watching and preventing becoming a big trend and pattern. People talk about partnership with civil society organizations. The UN, I mean, Ban Ki-moon, big thing, partnership, post-MDG goals, 2015, working with the private sector, working with CSOs. Yet at the same time, you see governments suffocating and constricting the space that CSOs can work in. You can't have a partnership with CSOs if at the same time you restrict media coverage of education, you make it hard for CSOs to register themselves. They ask awkward questions. CSOs are there to ask awkward questions, to raise the inconvenient truths, to be the grumpy people. And governments don't like that. And therefore we've got to fight what is a pattern, unfortunately, a trend of this constriction of space. So I hope that when the MDG goals are fashioned, the next set, that there's a really strong call for a fight against that, because without that, then we won't have these organizations to hold people to account, or to implement things better, or to fight for the rights of the most disadvantaged, because governments will have sat on them because they ask inconvenient questions.
Thanks, Nigel. And I think that's one of the great things about the meetings this week, actually, that we have representatives of civil society with finance ministers and education ministers coming together. So I'm going to take another batch of 4 questions, but if you keep the questions short, we may squeeze 5 in. So there's an incentive for you. So we'll start right here at the front.
Hi, my name's Amanda Gardner. I'm with Pearson. And I wanted to come back actually on something that was said on the floor and really challenge the notion that companies should be doing this out of some social responsibility rather than because of a market incentive. I joined Pearson not too long ago, but I've been working with companies in this space for a long time. And I can tell you that CSR budgets and philanthropic budgets are the first ones to get cut when belts get tightened. And that if you can find a way of making a real difference through, companies make profit through their profit-making activities, if you can inject a notion of social responsibility into those market-driven activities, you can make a lot more difference and leverage a lot more resources in that manner. There have to be accountability mechanisms for that, of course, but the same holds true for the CSOs, for the governments, et cetera. So I just wanted to come back on that and also ask the panel a question, and that is, there's a lot of talk now about innovative financing, and there are a lot of initiatives out there that Pearson and other companies are getting involved in, are involved in. We're involved in GPE, GBC Ed. We're highly engaged in a lot of these activities. How can we all work together, come together as a community to come up with a way to engage the private sector more effectively?
Thank you, Amanda. Right behind you.
Hey, good morning. My name is Yusuf Kairis from Dubai Cares. And my question is related to the role of media in the education debate. And unfortunately, the height and the focus on emergency response versus development. From Dubai and from our understanding, it's a very difficult battle to convince people on education when the media as well as issues around the world on emergency response tend to take up all of that media space. So I would appreciate if we can discuss on the media a little bit.
Thank you very much. And then there's the end of the sixth row, whatever.
Thank you. My name is Chernoba. I chair the Youth Advocacy Group for the Global Education First Initiative. I'm interested in what Mr. Grumpy, is that your new name, Nigel? Said earlier about trying to hold government feet to the fire on this question of education financing. Yeah. And I know that we talk often about, obviously, the massive gap in financing, but also the discrepancies in even the funds that are available and how those funds are spent. So as a group, over this week, we've been talking about what role young people can play, both in mobilizing additional funding in that advocacy, in being grumpy, to use your words again, sir, on on this government, but also in monitoring the implementation of funds in country and how we can mobilize young people to do that and partner with you guys in making this happen.
And one question right at the front here.
This is Bela Jamil from ITA, Pakistan. We also do ASER Pakistan. This is 3 short points. One is in terms of what are your greatest returns to investment in education. Is there any discussion this week on being able to look at different subsectors of education which produce much more tangible results, such as early childhood development? So if you had 2 years of that, what kind of results that would give? Or going up further up to post-secondary into technical, vocational, or even at secondary level, what would that, rather than always looking at basic as primary or up till grade 7. Now that's a way to be able to measure and be smart about it. Number 2, can we just connect it to the national identity card systems? We have NADRA, which looks at identification of children and families, particularly vulnerable. If we can actually somehow track people who have been given support through this additional financing to be able to reach some milestones. And finally, how are we ever going to count? And because this is a big problem, whilst we are trying to mobilize corporate sector, private sector to come and support education, there is no financing mechanism to be able to really measure it and report it within the country. It's all up in the air. And although the Security Exchange Commission of Pakistan, for example, may say that 1% or 2% the companies have to report on their profits, there is no way to be able to report it and acknowledge it in the mainstream systems.
Thank you. And I'm really sorry, I'm going to take one more here. I know there's lots of other people who've got their hands up, but please just, if you can keep it relatively brief.
Sure, yeah, thank you. I know all of us in this room is very passionate about education, and I appreciate the comment from Beth about a plea for openness and innovative ways of affecting education, and the comment from Amanda from Pearson about how do we create a platform. I think that civil society, I'm from Humana People to People. We're working on teacher training throughout sub-Saharan Africa. DRC is one of the big countries. And I think the task for us as civil society is really to open up and start identifying and coming up with plans with governments and other civil society organizations that really has long-term impact. And teacher training, as the gentleman from Aga Khan said, is absolutely critical. If we don't have the teachers and the quality, not just the numbers of teachers, but the quality of teachers that are able to stay and work in rural areas, mobilizing effective education, we're not going to get there. And I think...
Thank you.
Oh, my name is Marie from Humana People to People.
Thank you. So we're moving towards closure. Maybe what I could ask you to do, I'm just going to take up one or two of the themes that came up and invite you to respond to that. But if there are any closing remarks you would like to add as well. Alistair, there was actually the question from Pearson and others as well about the role of the partnership And I guess in a way the GP is an obvious focal point for the partnership. And it's something, again, that you did very successfully in Gavi. You know, you had very deep partnerships between the private sector, governments, and the NGO community. And it would be very interesting, I think, for us all to hear how you see the sort of, is there an analogue there with what you're doing in GPE, but also more broadly on how we can broaden and deepen that partnership.
Yes, I mean, one of my goals for myself at GPE is to broaden our engagement with the private sector. I see many, many, many points of interaction.
They just added additional
in a variety of ways. We have currently one board seat that is devoted to the private sector, which is both, I know we have to get together, which brings us the voice and the engagement of both the private foundation sector as well as the private commercial sector. And we need to engage with both of them for different reasons. So the GPE platform gives us a natural platform to do it. I think we probably need to do a better job at organizing it. I've now met with a number of corporates, and the job that I used to have, I met with a lot of corporates, and a lot of them are interested in education too, which was somewhat of a surprise. And because the entry point for all of them is the issue of competitiveness and talent. So a lot of people I've met with, though, so far have asked the following question. They've said, okay, we're very interested in this, but the question we now have to ask all of ourselves is, okay, fine, now what do we do? And what we need to do is figure out a way of organizing all of that talent and interest and engagement into something, okay? Now we got to figure out what the something is, okay? Is it a set of pilot projects? Is it advocacy? It's certainly advocacy, okay? That's something is going to be very important. Is it, what is it? And that's where I think we have to work together. One of the things that's in our strategic plan, and it's also, along with innovative financing, a pet interest of mine is innovation. And in the education space, to me, that is a number of pieces. It's not only literally technology innovation, although I think there's a there for us in this space. But it's also innovation in the whole sort of know-how piece around teaching. And how do we make sure that the textbooks are, well, there's a whole language piece, but then how do we make sure the textbooks sort of go through the science of reading properly? So I'm very interested in working in this area. Our board is structured to give us this. I mean, one of the real benefits of GPE is that we have a natural partnership model that we can leverage to bring to all these countries and give them a much broader sense of the art of the possible. So we have to get together. In terms of innovative financing, it is one of my absolute favorite topics. There's a number of people in the room who know that. And there's a lot of merit in looking at innovative financing mechanisms. We have to do it in education, but we have to do the hard work of asking ourselves the question, what's the problem that we're trying to solve before we go invent a bunch of solutions that ultimately may not fit what the problem is. So we should use our partnership model to bring together a group and start asking those questions. So we need to get together anyway.
Thank you, Alice. Beth, there are a whole range of wider issues, but one of the ones that has come up, of course, is teachers. And I guess in the end, the quality of what happens in education is ultimately a function of the relationship between teachers and kids in a classroom. And it would be, I think, useful and instructive for us to get your take on, what can be done to raise the general quality of what goes on in the classroom, in the teaching process and teacher training.
Right. Thank you very much. Our education strategy at the World Bank focuses on learning. And we say learning for all, although we know we mean education for all. But the choice of the word learning rather than education is purposeful. The reason for saying it's learning is because we want to be able to say that schooling counts when students learn, when pupils learn, we also use learning to mean to say that the education system is not only about schools. It is, as Bela is saying, we need to think about the youngest children and whether they're going to be ready to learn when it's time for them to go to school. We have to think about the millions of children who are out of school, not because they have never been to school, but the millions of children who are out of school who should be in school because they've given up on school. And I think we need, for them, they need a second chance. We need to think about the alternative learning systems that we need to have the education system offer so that they do not become adults without the skills they need for life and for their livelihoods. So when we think about, in our strategy, when we think about learning, we do think about learning really throughout the human life. Thinking about learning that needs to be the investments we need to make at the beginning of life, and also for adults, young adults, and older adults who have to be functional. We need to think about those who are disabled and cannot learn necessarily within the kinds of classrooms that our formal education systems have. We need to think about the alternative ways, the alternative learning opportunities for them. And teachers in all of these learning opportunities are key. I mean, I think you're right that we need to think about how technology, the new technologies can help us. But the technologies are just a tool for the learning process. We need the teachers, and the teachers are needed not only in the traditional classrooms, they're needed in all the kinds of learning opportunities we have to accept are part of a true education system. That is the way we need to think about the education system of the future. It isn't only about the traditional schooling that we've always thought of, and there are many things that are pushing us in this direction. We have the technology to actually be more innovative about what we mean by education. There are the challenges that young people have to face because the occupations, the jobs that are available now are not going to be around when they become adults. And there will be new ones that we've not even thought about. So we need to think about education, if we're going to be relevant, to be able to deal with, to help everyone, all the young people today, to be prepared for the kind of society and the kind of economy we see for the future. So my plea here, Kevin, is that when we think about education systems, let's think about what it is that we want that education system to be good for the society of the future, for the economies of the future, for the worlds of the future. When we think about climate change, and it's going to be one of the SDGs in the future, education is a big part of that. The challenge for us is, how can we make education be really a part of the solution for climate change, for peace and security, for all of those things that our peoples will be facing.
Thank you, Beth. And Nigel, there was one specific question to you, but please, I mean, if you just...
there were three, really. I mean, just standing back just for a second, I mean, I think we're moving into a different phase now, really, in this debate. I mean, the MDG goal was largely about access. In many societies, access has been accomplished. Not in all, but in many, at least at primary level. So I think we're moving into a phase about quality of education. That's the debate's going to be about. How do we deliver a better quality experience for children and young people? And people talk about teacher training. I don't like the phrase teacher training. I think it smacks of something from the 1960s.
Exactly.
I think we're talking about school leadership. That's a different thing altogether. And there's plenty of work around. I'm going to proselytize because I'm very proud of it. The UK National College of School Leadership has done some fantastic work on school leadership and how relatively small investment in one or two school leaders in an individual school transforms the quality of that school. So there are some good role models already out there where modest government investment creates fantastic results and turnaround in the quality of education. Two other points that were made. I mean, you're right about the difficulty in getting the media to kind of engage with development issues, particularly education. But we've got to hit back here. It's a false dichotomy to put humanitarian relief in one box and development in the other. You know, if you spend millions and millions of euros and years in developing these education, which is then destroyed in a series of earthquakes, you've got to start to rebuild that. And often, particularly for children, one of the things we've learned is the psychosocial traumatic impact of disaster is mitigated by getting children back to school as fast as possible. So education in emergencies is a very important part of how you respond in emergencies. So don't let people paint education development over here, humanitarian relief over here, because it's a completely intellectual nonsense. And we have to be able to fight back and say, don't put us in that box, and say to media, you have a responsibility to cover the long-term trends and patterns of change in society, not just to respond to the instant moment or the instant incident, however traumatic and gory and horrible that might be. Because you're not doing a service to society, frankly, if you focus on that. And the third thing is about the role of young people. Absolutely. And the best examples of holding to account are where young people are at the heart of shaping the goals, making the noise, being outspoken, and CSOs work with them to interact with politicians and leaders, sometimes frankly to embarrass people, to embarrass them to change, because politicians don't like being embarrassed. And some of the best things I've seen are when young people, particularly girls, have come and spoken about their demand for education, their needs, their issues. It's very difficult for a politician to avoid it. Adults, they can kind of blank. Children and young people, rather harder, if you think about it. So let's mobilize those voices to do that, because it is about holding to account. It is about feet to the fire. And I'm broadly optimistic. I mean, in some ways, we always, when we have these discussions, have, debates about how hard it is and it's all very complicated and so on. I mean, a great deal of progress has been made since 2000. Let's not lose sight of the big picture. But in some ways, the hardest bits is to come now. The most marginalized groups left out of the progress. The quality of education when you're in school. 9 years of education, not 1 or 2 dropping out because of social pressures. And find the skills to get a job. We didn't really talk about that today, but education is lovely. And it's very important to give people an inquiry mind. But if at the end of the day you're unemployed because you haven't got the skills to do a job, you won't be able to keep your family on that momentum to keep it on that upward trajectory out of poverty. So that would be my kind of big view of it, really.
Thank you. So we go forward in a spirit of grumpy optimism.
Yeah.
Just to end with a couple of very brief. I'm not going to try and summarise the discussion, and thanks to each of you, because it was absolutely fantastic and inspiring from all three of you. But I'm left with just a couple of thoughts, which is one of which is that every time I visit an urban slum or a poor rural area, and you speak to parents who are trying to get their kids, what we're all talking about here, like a decent education, what you actually see is actually almost primordial. This sort of ambition that parents have for their kids, because they understand how important this is. And I think somehow between those slums and those villages, and sometimes the high-level meetings that we have here, something gets lost. And somehow, we have to keep that energy, I think, and to hold people's feet to the fire. I think, secondly, the point that all three of you made in different ways is that just really positioning education right at the centre of these wider debates. The world is deeply concerned about youth unemployment. We're deeply concerned about climate change. The idea that we can solve those issues without getting education right, has to be a fiction. And the third point, which may sound trite, but I think is important, that 13 years ago, we made that commitment to get all kids into a decent quality learning environment by 2015. It's not 2015 yet, and we've got quite a way to go. And we're not going to get there unless we focus on the most marginalised kids. Yes. And I think these kids have a right to representatives here in DC and elsewhere that reflect their interests and aspirations. And I hope that what we do this week, will in some small way take their agenda forward. And if people have to be embarrassed by it, by being held to account, I think that's part of the price that has to be paid. So thanks to the three of you for fantastic contribution, and thanks to all of you for being here. Rebecca, Rebecca's going to make a short announcement.
I just wanted to close and thank our panelists and say we're going to have a short break, and can the next set of panelists come this way? We'll reconvene in 5 minutes, so talk to your neighbor, stretch. And thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you.